We label it a lack of discipline, but your dopaminergic baseline isn't actually the culprit. Sometimes, the habit isn't the problem. It is the structural fatigue of an existence where the reward systems have completely flatlined. Sometimes, it's the life wrapped around it. That somatic tracking of a nervous system that forgot how to downregulate. The dead silence after a brutal day at work. When your cognitive load has peaked, the absence of noise feels like a physical weight. The apartment that feels overwhelmingly, suffocatingly quiet. This is revenge bedtime procrastination, a desperate grab for agency in a life you no longer feel you own. The glow of the blue light at 1:13 a.m. The visceral feeling that your brain's neural network never fully stops firing anymore, a high beta frequency loop that follows you from the office all the way back to the suburbs. So, your nervous system demands a circuit breaker. You reach for something, anything, to mitigate the compounding weight of your current cognitive load. A smoke, a schooner at the local, your phone. These aren't choices of leisure. They are somatic anchors used to ground a system that's lost its tether. Another endless scroll, another video. You are desperately chasing a microdose of reward just to recalibrate a dopaminergic baseline that's been pushed to the brink. Another dopaminergic distraction. You aren't actually recovering. You're simply anesthetizing the exhaustion of a lifestyle your biology wasn't built to sustain. It's not because your willpower is shot, mate. It's not because you lack the grit your old man had, or because you're inherently weak. It's because the sheer cognitive load of this modern Aussie grind has hijacked your nervous system, making that circuit breaker feel like a biological imperative rather than a lapse in judgment. The real tragedy? Most people never even realize the shift. They don't see the moment their pursuit of success turned into a desperate physiological survival mechanism. They look in the mirror and pathologize their behavior, diagnosing themselves with a discipline problem because they can't stop the endless scroll or the 3 pints after 5. But the clinical truth? You aren't lazy. Your dopaminergic baseline is just completely cratered. You are fundamentally, somatically exhausted. Let's look at a case study. A bloke I knew who spent 20 years chain, smoking on his veranda, completely enslaved to a physiological loop he didn't yet realize was a survival strategy. He tried every protocol in the book, nicotine patches, cognitive therapy, even that tough-it-out Aussie grit. He was desperately chasing a stable dopaminergic baseline that his current lifestyle simply couldn't support. Every attempt was launched from a state of sympathetic hyperarousal. He wasn't just quitting, he was attacking himself with intensity, pressure, and rigid control. He thought he was being disciplined, but he was just redlining his nervous system. And every inevitable relapse shattered his psychological baseline. It wasn't just the nicotine, it was the shame. He felt smaller, convinced that his lack of willpower was a permanent character flaw rather than a dysregulated somatic response. But then, the external variables shifted. A work contract took him to rural Japan. Suddenly, the relentless cognitive load of his high-pressure life back home began to dissipate in the mist. While he was over there, immersed in that lower-frequency environment, a Zen practitioner offered him a directive that felt almost insulting to his corporate-honed intellect. It was too simple for someone used to high-stakes KPIs and grinding through the Friday Arvo fatigue. He looked him dead in the eye and said, "Stop weaponizing your willpower. Stop fighting the habit." Back here, amongst the gums, we struggle to grasp that. Because in our give it a red-hot go culture, we've been conditioned to believe that any meaningful transformation requires a massive, exhausting cognitive load. We've turned growth into a theater of war. We're told to crush our cravings, bypass our somatic signals, and force a dopaminergic reset through sheer, bloody-minded aggression. If it doesn't hurt, we think it isn't working. We have to realize that even the industry of self-improvement has become inherently violent. We're no longer seeking regulation. We're just colonizing our own nervous systems with more demands. The Zen approach rejects the warrior archetype entirely. The monk I met didn't view habits as malicious enemies to be crushed by sheer force of will. He saw them as somatic patterns, entrenched defensive algorithms that were once hardwired to buffer you against raw psychological pain. That cigarette at the pub after a 10-hour shift? It wasn't a failure of character. It was a desperate attempt to downregulate a systemic stress response. The mindless scrolling wasn't a lack of discipline. It was a cognitive anesthetic, masking a profound, lingering isolation we often struggle to voice. The behavior was never random or weak. It was a sophisticated biological adaptation to a nervous system pushed way beyond its dopaminergic baseline. Understanding this core physiological driver doesn't just change your routine. It completely rewrites your entire behavioral identity from the nervous system up. Because if that six-pack at the pub or that mindless scroll was originally deployed as a somatic buffer to help you survive a crushing cognitive load, then aggressive self-hatred is a redundant algorithm. It will never heal a fractured dopaminergic baseline. Only conscious, non-judgmental somatic tracking can recalibrate the system back to a state of regulated flow. The monk didn't demand he quit or exert more grit. Instead, he was told to engage in radical observation of the pre-habit arousal. Stop the internal brawl. Just observe. When that neurochemical craving spikes after a brutal day at the office, don't panic. This isn't a moral lapse. It is your amygdala firing a distress signal. Don't suppress it. Track it somatically. Treat it like a violent southerly buster rolling off the coast, fierce, loud, but ultimately passing through your physiology without becoming your identity. So he sat there, away from the pub's roar. For the first time, he realized the craving had a distinct physical architecture, a structural blueprint in his nervous system. It wasn't a need for a drink, it was a rising tide, a suffocating tightness in the chest, a sharp kinetic restlessness vibrating through his hands. Then, the breakthrough. When you hold space for that visceral charge without reacting, the wave finally crests. You realize you aren't fighting the tide. You're observing the fluid dynamics of your nervous system until the tension breaks. See, most cravings feel like a permanent structural failure, but they are merely transient neurochemical spikes, a temporary elevation in your dopaminergic baseline that screams for a fix, just to feel level again. They have a predictable trajectory. They peak, then they decay. Like a freight train hurtling past a dark crossing at midnight loud, rattling your bones, but destined to vanish back into the scrub. The critical flaw in our modern behavior is that we never sit still long enough to allow the half-life of that craving to finish. We reach for the pint or the scroll before the somatic signal even reaches its zenith. Our environments are engineered for instant dopamine loops. We are being Pavlovian primed to bypass the decay phase, keeping our cognitive load perpetually redlined until the exhaustion becomes silent and absolute. Notification, impulse, reward, zero friction. You're trapped in a perpetual dopaminergic loop that bypasses your prefrontal cortex entirely. Eventually, you atrophy the cognitive baseline required to just sit with yourself. Your neurobiology has lost the capacity for stillness without seeking an immediate stimulus. The Japanese framework for this is Kaizen, small, continuous neuroadaptation. We're rewiring the circuitry, one microscopic connection at a time, not blowing the fuse. It's not about waking up at 5 a.m. to violently reinvent your life overnight. That's just a performative ego hit that guarantees a crash by Wednesday. The nervous system flags massive, sudden change is a biological threat. It triggers a sympathetic overdrive, and your body rebels to protect its internal homeostasis. That is exactly why you relapse so aggressively after a burst of extreme motivation. You have triggered a physiological backlash, an allostatic load your nervous system simply cannot resolve without a total crash. Grounded and authoritative, Kaizen understands that a new identity must be built perceptually. We are bypassing the amygdala's threat detection by making the change so microscale it remains invisible to your survival instincts. 5 minutes less screen time, 1 page of a book before sleep. This isn't about the task. It is about re-regulating your dopaminergic baseline without triggering a withdrawal response. Quiet repetition, executed calmly, until the brain's resistance network simply shuts down. You are habituating your neural pathways to a new, sustainable stasis, while the rest of the city is still chasing shadows. Discipline is not a punitive boot camp where you flog yourself into compliance. It is the highest form of self-stewardship, a gentle, persistent recalibration of your somatic state to honor your potential. We're not just tidying a desk mate, we're engaging in neuroscaffolding. This is the strategic design of an environment where destructive escapes lose their functional utility, lowering the cognitive load on your prefrontal cortex so you don't have to white-knuckle your way through the day. Let's be real, the ultimate barrier to your growth isn't laziness. It's shame. Shame is a corrosive somatic weight that fractures your psyche, forcing you into a freeze response that you mistake for lack of willpower. To break the cycle, you must replace the punisher inside your head with radical, clinical compassion. Realize that your failures are just data points of an overloaded nervous system, not a reflection of your character. Next time you're reaching for that third pint or the endless scroll, engage in somatic tracking. Ask yourself, what was my nervous system begging for in that moment? Because beneath the habit is unmet emotional exhaustion, screaming for genuine regulation. True discipline isn't about becoming a hardened, unfeeling machine. It's simply staying present long enough to stop abandoning yourself when the pressure builds. That's the power of quiet discipline.